Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Tyrannical Minds, Psychological Profiling, Narcissism, and Dictatorship by Dean A. Haycock, Ph.D. Narrated by Paul Brion. Preface. One thing I don't understand about many dictators is why they like to do the stuff they do. A friend wrote to me after I told him I was writing this book. For example, I get up in the morning and think about what I would like to do: play guitar, go boating or kayaking, etc. They wake up and think, maybe I will attack another country so I can have their stuff, etc. Like my friend, many others who lack dictatorial ambitions have been perplexed by the behavior of men who in the past have dominated millions of their subjects and murdered millions more. Many of us are equally perplexed by living dictators and would-be dictators who threaten those of us who just want to play the guitar or go boating. The goal of this book is to informally place the contribution of the psychology of tyrants into the list of factors that explains the rise of such men. All of the tyrants considered here lived within the last 100 years. All happen to be men, a fact that accounts for the frequent use of the pronoun he when referring to them. As Queen Mary I of England and Ireland, known as Bloody Mary to her Protestant enemies, Rana Valona I, Queen of Madagascar, and others reminds us, however, not all tyrants or dictators throughout history have been male. A dictator is a person who holds complete autocratic control, a person with unlimited governmental power, according to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. While it's possible a dictator could be benevolent, often rulers with absolute powers rule in absolutely oppressive ways. Benevolent dictators like Lee Kuan Yew, who ruled Singapore for nearly 3 decades starting in 1959, and Josip Broz Tito, who ruled Yugoslavia for nearly 4 decades starting in 1944, are often cited as examples of this less common type of authoritarian ruler. Far more often, the dictator is a tyrant or despot, a ruler who uses brutality, intimidation, repression, imprisonment, torture, and murder to maintain power and achieve his or her goals. In this book, the label dictator, tyrant, and despot are used interchangeably since benevolent dictators appear less frequently. Getting inside the heads of foreign leaders and terrorists is one way governments try to gain an advantage when dealing with them. Government agencies of many nations hire psychiatrists and psychologists to study foreign leaders and prepare psychological profiles of their opponents. The Central Intelligence Agency, the U.S. State Department, and their equivalent organizations in both friendly and unfriendly countries hope these profiles will help them understand, predict, and influence the actions of friendly foreign leaders, as well as unfriendly dictators and terrorists of all ranks. To illustrate how intelligence agencies have profiled foreign leaders and how the information has been used to advance United States interests, studies of some legitimate and non-tyrannical heads of state are discussed in detail in Chapter 2 and referred to elsewhere in the book. The importance of this applied psychology is obvious when you consider that in the past century alone, despots, tyrants, and terrorists have been responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of innocent people. They have disrupted or ruined the lives of hundreds of millions more. Together, the actions of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Idi Amin, Muammar Qaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and Osama bin Laden have affected millions of lives directly and indirectly. Their murderous orders issued forth from headquarters, palaces, and hideouts where they lived, and in some cases hid, protected by their secret police or devoted followers. How do these killers differ from their victims? How can we explain their behaviors, including their urges to dominate, subjugate, torture, and slaughter? Many of them share similar abnormal personality traits, and in a few instances possible mental disorders that predict and explain their behavior. Psychologists working for intelligence agencies who routinely analyze the mental states of pathological leaders find that these men frequently have clusters of traits which are included in labels like the dark triad, the dark tetrad, malignant narcissism, psychopathy, and paranoid personalities. Recognizing these defining personality traits in tyrants provides important insights into their motivations and actions. These insights have in the past allowed governments to predict the behavior of adversaries and have provided important clues to explain how and why these men behave the way they do. These psychological profiles, however, have not always been accurate, particularly in the mid-20th century. Since then, leading psychiatrists like former Central Intelligence Agency analyst Gerald M. Post, M.D., have greatly improved the reliability of these efforts to figure out how foreign leaders, friend and foe, see the world, and how they might react in situations that could affect national security. Psychological profiling is a practice that tries to merge two soft sciences, psychology and political science, into a tool that can provide the ability to understand and, more importantly, predict the behavior of foreign leaders. Presumably, skilled psychologists capable of deciphering the quirks and disorders, the psychological strengths and vulnerabilities of foreign heads of state could provide significant and tangible benefits to their countries. Understanding how a foreign leader thinks and behaves, understanding his or her motivations and fears, could provide advantages in trade and other negotiations. It would allow governments to develop effective strategies for dealing with friendly and unfriendly nations. It could provide crucial advantages during crises situations and help in undermining the strengths of foes. The state of mind of a ruler or head of state is clearly a legitimate topic for study. It would be naive to ignore the mental states of rulers ranging from Caligula to Mahatma Gandhi, from Winston Churchill to Richard Nixon, from John F. Kennedy to Donald Trump, and hundreds of others, when attempting to explain their approach to governing and their successes and failures. The unusual and controversial presidency of Mr. Trump made it impossible to exclude him from this book. As discussed in later chapters, some mental health care providers are convinced that he poses a danger because he has a personality disorder. Others make no claims regarding a diagnosis, but insist that his behavior makes him a threat. Still others claim that he is not mentally ill, that he is a showman and provocateur, a person who admittedly exaggerates claims and always gets even for insults and displays of disrespect, all of which he admits in his books. I am not qualified to say which of these, if any, apply to the president. Anne Serling, daughter of writer Rod Serling, quotes her father, "Whenever you write, whatever you write, never make the mistake of assuming the audience is any less intelligent than you are. I go a bit further and assume that my listeners are more intelligent than I am. I assume they combine the information I provide with what they already know and learn from further research. I count on them to reach their own conclusions because I want to believe in them." Introduction. Today, we need psychology for reasons that involve our very existence. Carl Gustav Jung wrote more than 75 years ago. He included the quote in his last book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, published in 1961. We stand perplexed and stupefied before Nazism and Bolshevism because we know nothing about man, or at any rate have only a lopsided and distorted picture of him. If we had self-knowledge, that would not be the case. We stand face to face with a terrible question of evil and do not even know what is before us, let alone what to pit against it. And even if we did know, we still could not understand how it could happen here. Nazism, as a state power at least, crumbled into ruins like bombed-out Berlin above Hitler's underground bunker in 1945. Versions of communism, distant descendants of Bolshevism, are still around, but took a crippling blow when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. And yet, Jung's quote is just as relevant today as it was when he wrote it. As long as nations command weapons of mass destruction, our very existence is threatened. As long as violent non-state actors covet weapons of mass destruction, our very existence is threatened. The terrible question of evil remains a defining question about our species, about human nature. There is, however, one lament in Jung's pessimistic assessment where we have made progress. We now know how repressive dictatorships like Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao Zedong's China, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and scores of others throughout history can happen, and we now know how it can happen here. 1. Hitler's bedfellow. In the late summer of 1941, Walter C. Langer was recovering in his home from a double hernia operation when he received an unexpected phone call from Washington, D.C. The phone call was the result of something 42-year-old Langer had uncharacteristically done days earlier. At the time, he had been confined to a hospital bed following his operation. The inactivity made him bored and irritable. This explains in part why he was inspired to do something he had never done before. After reading in a morning newspaper an article that annoyed him, he described his irritation to his wife while she was visiting him. She listened patiently to his rant, but eventually grew tired of it. She urged him to tell the person who could do something about his complaint. So Langer wrote a letter to a government agency. He told the agency's planners, in effect, how they could do a better job and what they should do. Before being confined to bed for 10 days following his operation, standard post-operative care at this time, he had believed only cranks wrote letters offering unsolicited advice to government officials. Langer, however, was no crank. He was a respected and successful psychoanalyst practicing in the Boston area. He earned a master's degree and a PhD from Harvard University. A dedicated follower of Sigmund Freud's theories, he had even befriended the father of psychoanalysis himself and had been psychoanalyzed by Freud's daughter Anna. These were impressive credentials back in the days when Freudian psychology was still in vogue. As he described it in the introduction of his book, The Mind of Adolf Hitler, The Secret Wartime Report, Langer was a week or so into his hospital stay when he read about the government's plan to create a new agency called the Office of the Coordinator of Information. Its purpose was to coordinate all intelligence gathered by U.S. intelligence agencies. It was also to be responsible for conducting psychological warfare. The office was to be led by Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, the same man his wife urged him to contact. Langer was a veteran of World War I. He knew how inefficiently psychological warfare had been conducted during that war. Much of it was limited to exaggerating and even fabricating accounts of enemy atrocities. As a psychoanalyst, Langer was certain psychological warfare could be turned into a powerful tool if its practitioners could be convinced to make use of state-of-the-art psychological and psychoanalytic knowledge. Instead of dwelling on superficial aspects, he wrote, psychological warfare, should seek to exploit the unconscious and irrational forces which were far more potent. As his wife suggested, Langer addressed his unsolicited letter to Donovan. After mailing it, he decided he had done his duty. He returned to his home in Massachusetts to continue his rehabilitation and thought little more of his out-of-character act. Then he got the call from an assistant to Donovan. He learned that the colonel was interested in his views and wanted to speak with him over breakfast in 1 week. Against the advice of his doctor, Langer made the trip by train to Washington, D.C., the government center for preparations for the war that President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Donovan knew would soon engross the United States. Following the meeting, Langer agreed to work with Donovan. The projects the psychologist undertook to exploit psychoanalytical knowledge to improve morale and prepare the nation for war, however, didn't progress very far. Then, in the spring of 1943, 2 years after he first visited Donovan to discuss how psychoanalysis might aid the war effort, Langer had another interesting meeting with Donovan. By this time, the 60-year-old successful lawyer and Congressional Medal of Honor recipient nicknamed Wild Bill for his exploits during World War I was running a centralized wartime intelligence service, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. President Roosevelt had appointed Donovan chief of the new wartime intelligence agency on June 13, 1942. Before it was disbanded in 1945, the OSS grew to have 12,000 or so members. They gathered and analyzed intelligence, placed agents and recruited spies in enemy countries, conducted sabotage and other special operations missions, produced disinformation to confuse the enemy, countered enemy propaganda, and trained and supported resistance fighters in occupied countries. The OSS also produced analytical reports for Donovan, his lieutenants, and policymakers. The OSS faced significant resistance from many established government agencies. It enjoyed limited, and in some cases no cooperation from the State Department, military intelligence organizations, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The older organizations and their bureaucracies resisted cooperation. They were particularly concerned about protecting their individual turfs instead of working together to make the most efficient use of the intelligence they gathered. The bureaucratic pettiness displayed by government agencies in the 1940s presaged similar dysfunction 60 years later when the CIA withheld information from the FBI, information that might have helped prevent the tragedy of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. Donovan and the OSS successfully survived the home-based opposition during the war, but after the war, Donovan's protector, Franklin Roosevelt, was dead. The new president, Harry S. Truman, did not like the idea of a permanent U.S. spy agency. Donovan's recommendation to establish a permanent peacetime Central Intelligence Organization was dismissed. 2 years after the end of the war, however, in the face of the threat of Soviet aggression, the OSS served as the inspiration for the establishment of the modern CIA. The new CIA found places for many OSS veterans. It also continued the practice of producing analytical reports on subjects like the one Donovan discussed with Langer. The things that make him tick. "What do you make of Hitler?" Donovan asked the psychoanalyst. "You were over there and saw him and his outfit operating. You must have some idea about what is going on." Donovan respected Langer not only as a psychoanalyst, but also because he knew Langer had studied with Sigmund Freud in Germany for 2 years in the late 1930s. Langer had thus been in Germany during the time when Hitler had gained full power of the German government and right before he started World War II. Langer had even accompanied Freud when Freud wisely left Nazi Germany for Great Britain. Langer admitted to Donovan that Hitler was a complete mystery to him. Donovan assured the psychoanalyst that he was not alone in this respect. As the conversation continued, Langer gathered that there was a wide range of differing opinions about Hitler's psychology among those guiding the U.S. war effort. Donovan wanted to get a professional opinion to replace the propaganda and uninformed amateur insights that were then circulating in Washington, D.C. Now promoted to the rank of general by Franklin Roosevelt, Donovan told Langer that he needed a realistic appraisal of the German situation. If Hitler is running the show, what kind of person is he? What are his ambitions? How does he appear to the German people? What is he like with his associates? What is his background? And most of all, we want to know as much as possible about his psychological makeup, the things that make him tick. In addition, we ought to know what he might do if things begin to go against him. Then the general presented his challenge. "Do you suppose you could come up with something along these lines?" Langer recognized this was an unprecedented challenge. Psychologist Carl Jung was among the first psychologists to offer an opinion about the German dictator, but this was an informal impression and based on a superficial contact. In 1939, Jung observed the Führer and the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini from a distance of a few yards as the pair of chummy dictators watched a parade of goose-stepping German soldiers. Mussolini impressed Jung as being lively, robust, and someone closer to the rest of humanity in terms of his personality. He admired Mussolini because he was genuinely delighted at seeing, to use Jung's own word, the impressive goose-step. Hitler, on the other hand, impressed Jung as being almost inhuman, cold in his demeanor, humorless, and yes, scary. He saw Hitler's humorless demeanor as part of the man himself, rather than an image of strength he presented in public. In comparison with Mussolini, Hitler made upon me the impression of a sort of scaffolding of wood covered with cloth, an automaton with a mask, like a robot, or a mask of a robot. During the whole performance he never laughed. It was as though he were in a bad humor, sulking. Jung's impressions of the two dictators were merely that, impressions. They were superficial observations that Jung discussed as if they offered deep insight into the dictators' psyches. In the early 20th century, leading psychologists like Freud and Jung often presented analysis and even theories about human psychology which lacked scientific evidence. They often based their pronouncements on their observations and impressions more than on the rigorous collection and skeptical evaluation of data. Their work includes valuable insights and observations, but too often they include unsubstantiated and just plain useless conjecture. They lacked the measuring tools now available to study large groups of individuals, quantitate, and compare their traits and behaviors. These tools have greatly improved our understanding of both healthy and unhealthy personality traits. For example, we now have an estimate of how many of us have personality disorders according to defined sets of criteria. We don't have to accept a pronouncement, for example, that young children feel a sexual attraction for their opposite-sex parent and feel jealousy toward the same-sex parent as a normal part of psychosexual development, just because Sigmund Freud said so. At the same time, we don't have to be afraid of questioning such pronouncements and risk being cast out of Freud's inner circle, as his followers were, when their ideas differed from those of the founder of psychoanalysis. Reading the full extent of Jung's impressions of Hitler and others in the chapter Diagnosing the Dictators in C.G. Jung Speaking, Interviews and Encounters, clearly indicates that he was going beyond the data available to him in his explanations of their psychologies. He confused his personal impressions, often superficial, with insight into their minds. Present-day profilers of political figures have an advantage over Freud and Jung, not just in their attitude toward the validity of their pronouncements and opinions. While their access to and data regarding their subjects are limited, whatever they uncover can at least be considered in light of decades of extensive study of personality traits and disorders. Thousands of people with personality traits such as extreme narcissism, psychopathy, and paranoia have been examined and studied. Patterns and behaviors observed in many people frequently, not always but frequently, allow accurate predictions about future behavior of an individual if the diagnosis is done properly. Langer could not afford to rely on his mere impressions of Hitler, as Jung had done before he drew conclusions about the German leader. Langer was almost certain that no one had ever attempted to do what Donovan was asking him to do, and he was being asked to do it in wartime, with no access to the subject of the study, and with limited access to people who knew the subject best. Most of the information he could gather for such a study, Langer told Donovan, would have to come from literature. This meant books, speeches, newspapers, magazines, and propaganda reports, and much of that was likely to be unreliable. Langer would include interviews with persons who had known Hitler, but he also knew they could be unreliable as well. Furthermore, psychological evaluations and psychoanalysis were not really developed for this kind of investigation. General Donovan's own personality throughout his life included a significant amount of social intelligence, well-considered optimism, and little if any obvious fear of failure. Like many accomplished men, he spewed ideas. His daring approach earned him the highest military honor, and later as a lawyer brought him wealth. Fame for such men can be traced to their successful ideas, while their sillier suggestions fade away in the shadow of their greater accomplishments. Donovan also knew how to identify competent people and delegate to them. "Well," he said to Langer, "give it a try and see what you can come up with. Hire what help you need and get it done as soon as possible. Keep it brief and make it readable to the layman." And so, Langer recalled years later, I became a psychological bedfellow to Adolf Hitler. Langer had good reasons to worry about the task he had been given. There is a good reason that a cliché image in popular culture associates psychoanalysis with a reclining patient on a couch as an out-of-sight therapist listens and takes note. Freud's technique for treating patients involved many sessions and many hours of talk therapy designed to reveal childhood experiences and unconscious factors that had negative influence on the patient's mental well-being. Typical orthodox psychoanalysis could require 4 therapeutic sessions a week, and the treatment could go on for years. This now out-of-fashion system for treating neurotic patients simply wasn't designed to psychoanalyze a person who had never lain down on the therapist's couch. In the 1940s, Freud's theories began to spread through North American universities. Freud's popularity was reflected in the number of department chairs held by psychoanalysts in elite universities, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, scientific evidence supporting key elements of Freud's psychoanalytic theory was lacking. Sadly, Freud actively discouraged anyone challenging or testing his theories. Thus, intriguing insights concerning the influence of childhood experiences on adult behavior, the role the unconscious mind plays in governing behavior, and the clinical value of uncovering and dealing with repressed emotions were not explored by skeptical researchers, something that is a defining feature of the scientific process. At this stage in its rapid expansion, psychoanalysis became more dogmatic than scientific. Psychoanalysis stresses the role unconscious mental processes play in determining how a person behaves and feels. Although Freud recognized that it is not useful for treating a serious mental illness like schizophrenia, psychoanalysts were and are convinced that helping a patient understand the unconscious elements influencing their behavior could lead to a more satisfying life. Today, some psychologists prefer to refer to one of Freud's greatest contributions, recognition of unconscious mental processes, as non-conscious mental processes. Non-conscious works as well and has less Freudian connotations. Problems with psychoanalysis began almost immediately, with Freud himself. As Jeffrey A. Lieberman, M.D. points out in his book Shrinks, The Untold Story of Psychiatry, despite having significant and prescient insights, Freud's theories were also full of missteps, oversights, and outright howlers. Among these are the Oedipus complex, which claims that boys have an unconscious desire to kill their fathers and marry their mothers, and the concept of penis envy. This howler maintains that psychologically normal young females go through a stage in their psychosexual development when they wish they had a penis. Modern psychoanalysts have modified the interpretations of Freudian complexes like these to make them less silly and more relevant. But Freudian psychoanalysts remain a minority influence in the field of modern clinical psychology and psychiatry. Had Freud encouraged or welcomed challenges to his ideas, rather than setting himself up as an unquestionable high priest of psychoanalysis, his contribution to psychology might be significantly greater than it is. Nevertheless, Freud can claim significant contributions to our present-day understanding of developmental psychology and mechanisms underlying cognition, as Lieberman pointed out. Thanks to Freud, we appreciate the significant influence childhood experiences have on our psychological development and adjustment to adult life, and we better understand the concept of unconscious motivations and their effect on how we perceive and respond to others. As psychoanalysis became less popular, some psychoanalysts did something that would have appalled Freud and his devotees up until the 1990s. They considered using modern public relations techniques to attract patients. In 1998, the American Psychoanalytic Association realized that the declining popularity of psychoanalysis necessitated what some traditionalists considered radical change. They sought to increase press coverage, hired a public relations firm, and tried to teach member psychoanalysts how to communicate effectively with the public through journalists. Psychoanalysis from a distance. Langer knew he could not formally psychoanalyze Hitler. He could only gather what information he could and suggest how his interpretations of that information, based on his psychoanalytic training, would influence his subject's future behavior. Listening to a patient talk about his childhood and his feelings for hours on end is very different from using secondary sources and testimony from people of unknown reliability who claim to have known the subject of the investigation. But it was wartime. Donovan was persuasive, and Langer was motivated to demonstrate the value of applying psychological and psychoanalytical insights to wartime activities. So with the help of his collaborators, Professor Henry A. Murray of the Harvard Psychological Clinic, Dr. Ernst Kriss of the New School for Social Research, and Dr. Bertram D. Lawin of New York Psychoanalytic Institute, Langer began to research Adolf Hitler. Langer, of course, could only rely on the relatively scant information about the Nazi dictator available in 1943. 7 decades of historical research has greatly increased our knowledge about Hitler. This information has allowed historians to debunk some of the false information that was available to Langer and his team. It is understandable that Langer had to use questionable intelligence to help him formulate a profile of Hitler. It's remarkable that despite this disadvantage, he was able, as we will hear, to so accurately predict the dictator's behavior. Either because of or despite, depending on your opinion of the value of Freudian psychology, Langer's reliance on psychoanalytic theory in his efforts to profile Hitler and predict his behavior, the psychologist concluded his profile with only 1 inaccurate prediction and 6 impressively accurate ones. Langer concluded that 1. There was only a remote possibility that Hitler would die of natural causes. After the war, the Allies learned that Hitler's health was spiraling downward as he was driven into his Berlin bunker, where he eventually faced inevitable defeat. He was, however, relatively physically healthy in 1943. At least he was healthy enough to mismanage the German war effort so badly that the 1,000-year Third Reich he promised his nation was shortened to a mere dozen years, its definitive end coming on April 30, 1945, when Hitler died of suicide. 2. It was extremely unlikely that Hitler would seek refuge in a neutral country. Witnesses to Hitler's last days in the bunker confirmed that the dictator was determined to take Germany down with him as he faced defeat. The German people, he insisted, deserved to be destroyed if they were not strong enough to win. Fleeing was never an option for him, not even to his Bavarian mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden, Bavaria, Germany, the Berghof, which members of his still loyal and devoted inner circle urged him to do. 3. It was a real possibility that Hitler might die in battle. This is the only scenario that seems, in hindsight, much less likely than the psychologist assumed it was when he suggested this possibility 2 years before the Allied victory. He incorrectly concluded that if Hitler faced certain defeat, he might lead his troops into battle and expose himself as the fearless and fanatical leader. Langer appreciated Hitler's fear of being humiliated by being vanquished, but the psychologist did not appear to factor this insight into this particular prediction. If he failed to die in battle, the dictator would then have risked capture. Hitler never would have risked capture by directly facing the enemy during World War II, because capture was guaranteed to result in humiliation, something an extremely narcissistic person could not tolerate. 4. The possibility could not be entirely excluded that Hitler might become insane. In fact, as the end approached, the Führer's mental health began to suffer significantly under the strain. He began, for instance, to rely on military forces that did not exist to defeat the approaching Soviet army. He raged uncontrollably at his generals and the deteriorating military situation as the Soviet army advanced toward and into Berlin. Although this does not suggest psychosis as much as intense stress in the face of inevitable failure and disaster, it does indicate significant mental instability. Despite his rages...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?